My name is Donald Trump. I am the President of the United States. My Executive Order number 14160 holds that the United States should no longer issue or accept documentation of citizenship for a person born in the U.S. when 1. The person's father was not a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, and 2. The person's mother was either unlawfully present or lawfully but temporarily present in the United States.
The question before us today is whether federal courts have the authority to issue universal injunctions. And our answer is
no. Federal courts do not have the authority to issue universal injunctions.
We dissent.
What? How did you make that decision?
In Grupo Mexicano de Desarrollo via Alliance Bond Fund, we ruled that federal courts only have the authority to grant equitable, meaning non-monetary, remedies, such as injunctions, that were traditionally accorded by courts of equity when our nation was founded. Therefore, we must determine whether the High Court of Chancery in England at the time of the United States founding issued universal injunctions or analogous forms of relief. The answer is no. Suits in equity were brought by and against individual parties, and relief was only granted to those individual parties, not to everybody in the country. Courts throughout the early United States also refused to issue universal injunctions well into the 20th century. Because universal injunctions are ahistorical, federal courts lack the authority to issue them.
This decision is an existential threat to the rule of law.
When a court concludes that the executive branch has acted unlawfully, the court's answer should not be to issue a universal injunction that in turn exceeds its own power.
I concur with Justice Barrett and write separately to emphasize that courts can never award relief beyond what is necessary to completely redress the plaintiff's injuries. Relief must fall within traditional limits on a court's equitable power, and considerations such as justice for the defendant must also be taken into account.
Regardless, federal courts do not have the authority to issue universal injunctions. Therefore, the government's request for a partial stay of the injunctions against President Trump's executive order is granted.
You rule, Supreme Court.
You suck, Supreme Court.
In the December 2017 issue of the Harvard Law Review, Professor Samuel Bray defined a nationwide injunction as injunctive relief in which a court binds the federal government even in its relations with non-parties. In other words, it refers to the practice of federal judges issuing injunctions that don't just limit the ability of the executive branch to do the thing it is being sued for by the complainant who stands before the court to the complainant who stands before the court, but which also extend that limitation to every person and thing and entity in the entire country. And if you possess an 8th grade level understanding of how American jurisprudence traditionally works, you know practices like that tend to fly in the face of the concept of standing, which says the party who brings the suit before the court has to show to the satisfaction of the judge that they are liable to be unlawfully harmed by the exercise of executive power in question. And the other component of standing, traditionally, again, is that if you are a person or entity or corporation that is based in, let's say, the Southwest District of Tennessee, then you may only seek relief from a judge in that same district. And if you successfully demonstrate standing, and you litigate the case, and you get a favorable judgment, that judgment only applies to you and any co-litigants who have signed on to the case, and it only applies in the Southwest District of Tennessee. But the practice of nationwide injunctions, it didn't really exist for the first 175 years of American history. There was only one of them on record prior to the turn of the 20th century, and there were only 2 prior to 1925. In the 100 years since then, there have been 138 nationwide injunctions. 104 of those, and counting, were issued against President Donald Trump, and 96 of those were issued by Biden and Obama judges. It's Tuesday, the 9th of September. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, rated by TripAdvisor as the number 3 most hellish dungeon in the entire kingdom. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about Democrat Party lawfare. You may have thought you'd seen the end of the age of lawfare when, after 4 solid years of ceaseless efforts by a motley collection of inept, corrupt attorneys general and district attorneys and crooked judges to come up with any possible way of throwing Donald Trump into prison and thus forcibly denying him the ability to regain the presidency, he regained the presidency anyway. But that wasn't the end of Democrat Party lawfare. The venue just moved to a different battlefield. A battlefield more often than not presided over by a female Biden-appointed judge, almost always a female judge of color, often born outside this country, often having names like Sparkle and Amame and Windfeather. And I didn't make up those first 2, just the third one, as depressing as that is. And as everybody knows who hasn't been living under a boulder in the woods for the past 8 months, President Trump, since the start of his second term, hasn't been able to engage in really any lawful exercise of presidential executive power without it being immediately struck down by some Biden-appointed woman immigrant judge in the Northeast District of wherever. And when you read the written opinions that these self-styled black-robed autocrats issue along with their rulings, as I encourage everyone to do, it's often really some quite shocking stuff. It's not the kind of thing that makes you think, yes, this person has a lifetime of legal education and training and a very deep and abiding understanding of constitutional history and American jurisprudence, and it's a good and proper thing that they should have been elevated to the lofty station of a federal district judge. On the contrary, when you read these things, what you more often find yourself thinking is, this is just some dumb neurotic woman making a list of her personal preferences and talking about her feelings and her emotions. There is no legal rationale here. There is nothing resembling legal rationale here. The legal rationale is limited to, I think this is bad, I don't like it, therefore it's illegal, and the president can't do it. But that's not all it makes you think. It also makes you think, this person doesn't even have any evident facility at writing the English language. This is the sort of semi-literate harangue I could get from any third-rate purple-haired woke internet troll. And I do apologize to any third-rate internet trolls whom I may have offended by comparing them to a Biden-appointed district judge. So clearly, this is a corrupt, odious, cynical practice. It has no basis whatever in the law or in 250 years of judicial precedent. It is only designed to gum up the works of government and prevent Donald Trump from doing things Democrats don't like, but which the voters of the country tasked him to do when they elected him to the presidency last year. So the next time you see some idiot Democrat on your television giving some sanctimonious monologue about how much their side loves things like guardrails and institutional norms and our democracy, you should just laugh at them for being such shameless, damnable liars, because that's the only response they really deserve. And this practice also, just as odiously, inhibits the ability of the Supreme Court to do the work the Supreme Court is supposed to be doing. Because when every lawful exercise of presidential power is routinely struck down by a nationwide injunction from Judge Amame Windfeather Nosering in the Southeastern District of Rhode Island, the Supreme Court has to spend most or all of its time hearing emergency appeals and striking down these obviously corrupt acts of judicial activist lawfare. And the Supreme Court has had just about enough of this crap, as it indicated in its majority opinion in the case of Trump v. Casa Incorporated on the 27th of June this year, in which, in uncharacteristically strong language, they told the lower courts to knock this shit off because they know it's wrong. Writing for the majority in the 6-3 decision, Justice Amy Coney Barrett said the following, quote, "Some say that the universal injunction the judiciary gives a powerful tool to check the executive branch, but federal courts do not exercise general oversight of the executive branch. They resolve cases and controversies consistent with the authority Congress has given them. When a court concludes that the executive branch has acted unlawfully, the answer is not for the court to exceed its power too." End quote. In his concurring opinion, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote, quote, "For good reason, the court today puts an end to the increasingly common practice of federal courts issuing universal injunctions. The court also makes clear that the complete relief principle provides a ceiling on federal courts' authority, which must be applied alongside other principles of equity, and our holding that universal injunctions are impermissible. Lower courts should carefully heed this court's guidance and cabin their grants of injunctive relief in light of historical equitable limits. If they cannot do so, this court will continue to be duty-bound to intervene." End quote. But unfortunately, no matter how corrupt the actions of the lower courts, the High Court possesses no enforcement power to make them stop doing it, and so they have kept right on doing it, because stopping the bad orange man is the only thing that matters. And each time they do it, the Supreme Court has no recourse except to stop what it's doing, again, and hear another emergency appeal and issue another opinion that repeats the language of the last opinion. And you might find yourself asking, doesn't this Supreme Court ruling have no teeth unless Congress gives it some teeth? It's an excellent question, and the answer is an emphatic yes. Now, who currently controls both houses of Congress? That would be the Republicans. They are the only ones with the power to enshrine the court's ruling into the U.S. Code and make it the statutory law of the land. Until they do that, there is no real-world mechanism that stops these corrupt litigants and these corrupt courts from continuing to do the same bullshit they have been doing. And you would think the president's party would have a great sense of urgency in stopping this nonsense so the president is able to govern as all previous presidents have governed and to do the things that he was elected to do. But what do we hear from the Republican Congress? Absolutely nothing. Just the sound of crickets chirping the night away. So if you have a Republican congressman, I encourage you in the strongest possible terms to light up his phone lines and his email inbox and ask him the perfectly reasonable question, where is the bill, dude? Why are you hanging our president out to dry? Why do you guys suffer from such a congenital inability to locate your own testicles? When can we expect you to stop being such a bunch of spineless, feckless, douchebag cowards who can't bring yourselves to do what you know must be done? And I guess that was 4 questions, but you should ask all of them, because you're damn well entitled to an answer. If they won't do the thing unless they are shamed and embarrassed and humiliated into doing it, then they need to be shamed and embarrassed and humiliated, and only you, the constituent, has the power to do that. It is a matter of urgent, pressing importance that a law be passed prohibiting federal district judges from issuing any nationwide universal injunctions, and it's a matter of equal importance that a bill be passed prohibiting the practice of judge shopping, which is a big part of the equation in most or all of these frivolous injunctions, and which the Supreme Court also addressed and condemned in the majority opinion in Trump v. Casa. If you're a pro-open borders Democrat Party-affiliated NGO based in Los Angeles, you shouldn't be able to shop around from state to state and district to district until you find a judge who is sufficiently corrupt to give you the decision that you're looking for. That has to be banned. Both of those things have to be banned. You don't even have to pass multiple bills. You can put them both in the same bill. You don't have to worry about the bill withstanding judicial review because the Supreme Court just told you the exact language that you should use when you were drafting it. But the crickets in the Washington swamp, they continue to chirp away. And you shouldn't tolerate that because it's goddamned intolerable. But before we go, I want to touch briefly on the other kind of lawfare that exists and is equally intolerable at the state level. And it's not anti-Trump so much as it's anti-civilization. If you haven't seen the video of the innocent 23-year-old female Ukrainian refugee being knifed to death for no apparent reason on a Charlotte, North Carolina commuter train by a career criminal with at least 14 prior felony convictions, I encourage you to not watch it, because it will live in your brain forever, and you don't want a thing like that living in your brain forever. This is another phenomenon that we see far too often with increasing frequency from judges in Democrat-controlled states who are very often women and very often black, and who simply don't believe in any traditional conception of what we used to call criminal justice. They believe in something called restorative justice, which means that the defendant's racial heritage and economic background are the only factors that can ever be considered when passing sentence. If we were a serious country that cared about the safety and security of innocent people just trying to go about their business, a bloodthirsty monster like the animal that killed the young woman on the Charlotte train would have been locked up permanently and the key thrown away by the 2nd or 3rd felony conviction. The longest stretch this guy ever served was 5 years. And then he was right back out on the streets terrorizing and victimizing decent law-abiding people who just want the freedom to live their lives in peace, which shouldn't be an unreasonable expectation in the United States of America. But when this guy was convicted of his 14th felony, did the black woman judge do the sensible thing and sentence him to life in prison with no possibility of parole? She did not. She decided that because he came from a troubled background and had mental health challenges, he shouldn't go to prison at all. Rather, he should be sentenced to a diversion program in which the judge herself happens to hold an ownership stake, and how badly I wish I was making that up. And we can reasonably assume that this diversion program involved drinking cucumber smoothies and doing some yoga classes and writing some essays about his feelings. And the judge probably felt great about herself, since she had abided by the precepts of restorative justice by not putting a black man in prison, and she made a few bucks for herself in the process. And does she feel one single pang of empathy for the young woman who escaped war-torn Ukraine, only to be suddenly and violently exsanguinated on an American train by a crazed psychopath who should have long ago forfeited any right he ever had to live outside the walls of a maximum security prison? I doubt it. In fact, I can almost guarantee she doesn't. I'm done. That's all I've got. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Get off my lawn.